I got to go find something. Hold on. Smoke them if you got them. Hey, Frankie, say hi to Riverbend. Say hi. This is my granddaughter, Frankie D. Howell. She had her first birthday last Sunday. So she is 1 year and 1 week old. And she is wondering what in the wide world of sports is going on here. Now, Frankie, and her name, her parents chose the name Frankie. It is my son-in-law's grandmother's name. And we like the name Frankie, but we weren't given a vote in what her name would be. But we get to call her whatever we want. And I call her the Bean. You're the Bean, right? And her grandmother calls her Little Peanut. And her mother, for some reason, calls her Hamuna. I don't know, it's a word she made up. Yeah, you're Hamuna. I think it might mean like, yeah, that. It might mean like, yeah, it's Hamuna. Yeah, and but we do, and if you're a grandparent, you understand this. As a grandparent, you get to pick your grandparent name. Yeah, and mine will not be which some people do. They name themselves as grandparents after their first words. They say, "Oh, she's talking about me." And my wife really struggled to come up with a good grandma name. I suggested Hottie G. And she wasn't going to have that, but I thought it'd be adorable to see little Frankie. You pulled the microphone right out and into your mouth, Frankie. We're just gonna, yeah, we're ad-libbing this. Anyway, yeah, and if you know, my grandpa name is, what's my grandpa name? El Jefe. Jefe is my grandpa name. So I am El Jefe, and Diane has decided to be called Gigi instead of Hottie G. So we're going to go with those. But yeah, I wanted you to meet her because the thing I wanted to say is that this little nugget right here makes me very happy. But more than that, they're clapping for you, Peanut. She brings me joy. Now I'm going to joyfully give her back to her parents over here. Jeremy, you want to come get the Hamuna? There's Daddy. All right. Gotta fix this, such as it is. Don't worry about it. Yeah, you don't need to hear me. You just got the good part. Now, for some of us, we think that happiness and joy are synonymous. And to a large degree, 2/3 of happiness is joy and 2/3 of joy is happiness. But that third that's different is vitally important. And today I want us to think about what makes joy different from happiness. And I want to suggest there's one primary thing that separates joy from happiness. But before we talk about that, and before we search for joy, I'd like to pray. Would you pray with me? Father in heaven, I would ask that the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart would be pleasing in your sight, that you would use your words spoken by your servant, anointed by your Spirit, to call us to seek joy. May we seek it with our whole heart, and may we find our joy in you. Pray that for myself and for my family, for all of us here, for I ask that in Jesus' name. Amen. I am, by most people's estimation, I am a heretic. Most people would call me a rogue theologian. I don't fit into any theological categories, and I'm kind of glad that I'm a heretic. But I got called out recently. In fact, I got called out last week for a heretical thing that I said here last Sunday. Last Sunday, we were in our second week of an examination of a passage, 2 verses from the book of Galatians. Galatians chapter 5, verses 22 and 23. Galatians 5, 22 and 23 says that the fruit of the Spirit is love, and it is joy, peace, patience, goodness, kindness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Against such things there is no law. And I suggested, well, I didn't suggest, I said outright, that the sentence construction, the syntax and the grammar of Galatians 5:22 implies that the fruit of the Spirit is just love, that it is a singular fruit, and that the fruit of the Spirit is love. Now, grammatically, you would expect that if that were true, the 8 nouns that follow love would be preceded by a colon. And there is no colon. In fact, there was no punctuation in the original Greek manuscripts. And so I was accused over this past week of being a heretic, of making stuff up. Because most of us understand that it is a multiple of the fruit of the Spirit. Joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control are all equal to love. But I said, no. And so what I did, I went to my library and I looked at half a dozen of my Greek grammars, books that explain Greek grammar, and researched, including BDF and my professor Dan Wallace's grammar, and I found a form of syntax in the Greek language called nepotasis. And this was my first Greek grammar, and I had to take first year Greek twice. That's why this is so worn out. But we're not going to comment on that. But this is what Gettius says about the apodosis, or the form of speech that I'm suggesting is in Galatians chapter 5. It says, nouns are frequently used very much like adjectives to modify other nouns. Like love is used, and joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control are modifiers. And when so used are called appositives, or said to be in apposition. Now the standard for Greek grammar is this beast right here. This is the reference standard for Koine New Testament Greek grammar. It's by a guy named A.T. Robertson. Can you imagine working on this your whole life? Man, you must have been a riot at parties. I mean, how's that syntax? How's the aorist case coming there, A.T.? Oh man, you're such a riot. But it is the authoritative understanding of the grammar of the New Testament. And this is what A.T. Robertson says. He says, the earliest and always a common way of explaining the subject was by the addition of another substantive, explaining love by adding joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. The earliest method was apposition. Apposition can be employed with any case, nominative, genitive, vocative. The word in apposition conveys the main idea, love, and may vary greatly in the precise result of the apposition, a matter determined wholly by the word itself and the context. So this syntax, the grammatical structure of apposition, is possibly what's going on in Galatians chapter 5. But none of the grammars that I read reference Galatians chapter 5 as an example of apposition. So I went and I looked at a dozen New Testament commentaries, including F.F. Bruce and Martin Luther and Ronald Fung and all the best commentaries on Galatians. And I found this in the International Critical Commentary by a guy named Robertson, Burton. Burton's commentary on Galatians. And this is what he says about Galatians 5:22 and 23. Whether the terms listed in Galatians 5:22 and 23 fell in the apostle's mind into definite classes is not altogether clear. Agape, the word for love, stands in a sense in a class by itself and is probably thought of as the source from which joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, faithfulness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control flow. All the rest flow. There's another commentary, the Word Commentary, which is an excellent biblical commentary on Galatians by a fellow named Longnecker. He says this: if there is an emphasis in this list of 9 items, it is probably seen in the first item, love, for that is where in the Greek structure one would expect to find the thing being stressed. Furthermore, the primary reference to love suggests that all the other virtues listed result in some manner from love. Deal with that. Now, the reason that I just dragged you through that grammatical dust was not simply to make an argument for the understanding that I am proposing that the fruit of the Spirit is love, and that joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, faithfulness, goodness, gentleness, and self-control are modifiers of love. It's that if we're going to really understand what the fruit of the Spirit is, we understand love by each of these nouns, and we understand each of these nouns by love. And this is particularly important when it comes to joy. In 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 13, it says, now these 3 remain, faith, hope, and love. The greatest of these is love. So in order to understand what makes joy different than happiness, we have to see that it's sourced in love. It's an awareness of the love of God for us and our love for God. That separates happiness from joy. This is not just good theology, it's also good psychology. You may not realize it, but it wasn't until 1962 that Massachusetts Institute of Technology began the first academic department for neurobiological research. 1962. It wasn't until 1966 that the Harvard Medical School had a department of neurobiology in their medical school. So it's just in the last 70 or 75 years that we've begun to understand how our brain functions. Imagine what we'll know 75 years from now will seem positively barbaric by those standards. But today it is most commonly agreed that our brains are made up of a number of parts. There are lobes. There's the frontal lobe and the occipital lobe and the parietal lobe and the temporal lobe. And that those 4 lobes are each part of the left and the right hemispheres. And the left and the right hemispheres of the brains account for different responsibilities emotionally and physically, how we process the world. And this is understood. We've come to know this because we have studied people with traumatic brain injuries. And a person who has brain trauma to their prefrontal cortex on the right side will have a tendency to, after that injury, behave in manic ways where they're focused on, hyper-focused on the details of life and the issues of the moment. Whereas if a person has damage to the left prefrontal cortex, they have a tendency to become apathetic and even relentlessly depressed. And what we have found in the studies of how our brain works is that our left hemisphere and our right hemisphere have almost contradictory functions. that the left hemisphere is focused on the things that we don't know, the uncertainties, left hemisphere is focused on what we do know. The things that are certain, the things that are concrete, the details of the day, the facts of life. The right hemisphere is much more focused on the abstract, on the unknown, on the future things, on the holistic view. It's not linear thinking, it's holistically thinking. And to some degree, in our brains, there is a constant tension, almost a chaos, that exists between one side of our brain that says, oh, you better not do that. That's terrible. That's going to go badly. And the other side of our brain that goes, let's do it right now. It's going to be awesome. And some of you are very well aware of that tension that is in your head. But the reality is right in the middle of those two things, making order out of the chaos, making sense out of the abstract, is where joy resides. Joy is found in the middle. Joy is found in the balance. I like someone who said that joy is found at the height of the adventure, when the most thing is at risk, when there is the greatest chance of failure. That's when we find the deepest sense of joy. It was a Tuesday morning. And we were living in the East Bay of San Francisco, in a little town called Pleasanton. And it was my habit to go out in the mornings to go for a 3 or a 5 mile run. That was my workout for the day. And because all of our girls were still in school, they were in high school, and my wife was a teacher in an elementary school, I would have to go out early enough that I could be back before Diane left for school so I could get the girls up to go to high school. And so it was probably about 6:45 in the morning when I got back from my run, and I got into the house, and I flipped on the television, and I went into the kitchen to get some water. And I heard from the television Dan Rather's voice. Do you know who Dan Rather was? Dan Rather was the voice of the CBS Evening News. And this was 6:45 in the morning. And I thought, well, they must be playing something that he said yesterday. And then he began talking and saying that they weren't sure what had happened, but it was possible that the South Tower of the World Trade Center had collapsed. It was 9:59 in the morning, New York time, Eastern Standard Time, on September 11th, 2001. Many of you who were alive or who remember that day remember very viscerally where you were, what you were doing. You probably have moment-by-moment memories of how that morning unfolded. For me, I heard Dan Rather say, the South Tower of the World Trade Center appears to have collapsed. And I walked out, and I remember seeing on the television screen just dust. You couldn't make anything out. And I remember thinking, that's not possible. You see, we had been there just a couple months before. We had been in Manhattan, and we had been at the World Trade Center complex. And if you were ever there, the buildings were massive. They were gigantic, and they were enormous. And I was pointing out to our girls, I said, these are the tallest structures in the world. There's tens of thousands of people that work in them every day. They're amazing, the World Trade Center. I remember thinking that these were indestructible. And now, as the dust cleared, I saw an image. In fact, the South Tower had in fact collapsed. I think we all remember all of the events of that day. I remember thinking in that moment, I have to go get the girls. And I ran upstairs, and I woke them up, and I said, you need to wake up and come downstairs right now, because the world you live in is changing forever. And you need to see this, so that you will remember for the rest of your lives the day that this happened. And we came down and we sat and we watched in disbelief what was unfolding before our eyes. And now 22 years later, if I engage with that memory, it's almost as visceral as if it were happening in this moment. Diane and I were watching a documentary on Monday, on September 11th, and it told the story of a New York firefighter, a battalion chief named Oriole Palmer. Oriole Palmer was assigned to lead a rescue team up in the South Tower. And Oriel Palmer led a group of men, and there's an audio recording of him talking to the dispatcher as he was ascending the floors of the South Tower. And he was in good enough shape that he was in full fire department turnout with all of his gear, which is over 100 pounds worth of gear. And he was hiking up 70 floors. And he was giving transmissions to the dispatcher saying, we have 1045s, we have code zeros. He was finding bodies of people as he got above the 70th floor and approached the 73rd floor. At the same time, there was a woman who had called 911. Her name was Melissa Doy, and she was trapped on the 78th floor. And she was talking to the dispatcher, fearing for her life, believing that she was about to die. And the dispatcher kept telling her that help was on the way. At just moments before 9:59 a.m., Melissa Doy, the last thing she ever said, was, "I hear someone coming." Many people believe that it was Captain Oriel Palmer making his way into her presence in the moments before they both perished. We had to turn off the documentary, both of us, because it so ruined us, it so affected us. 22 years later, it's still a petrifying, a terrifying, a tragic thought. So you may feel somewhat awkward. You may feel somewhat insulted when I suggested that there was joy there. That there was joy there on September 11th. That there was joy in those moments. You see, on that day, it's estimated, we don't know for sure even now, there were somewhere around 3,000 people who died on September 11th in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, the Pentagon, and in the World Trade Center. 343 of those 3,000 that died were New York City firefighters. And they died in those buildings, but in those buildings that morning, it's estimated there were between 16 and 18,000 people working at the time of the impact. That means as many as 14 or 15,000 people survived that day because of the heroism, because of the courage, because of the gallantry that was on display in stark relief against the darkness and the horror of that moment. This is called theodicy. How can we believe in a good God in light of evil? We can believe in a good God in light of evil because the darkness does not overcome the evil. We find the joy in the midst of the tragedy. That's the difference between happiness and joy. There's a ridiculous verse, and it's in the book of James. In James chapter 1, the Apostle James begins his letter in the second verse with a ridiculous statement. He says this, "Consider it pure joy, my friends, when you find yourself facing various or many trials. Consider it pure joy when life gets hard, when the days get dark, when the weight of the world is crushing in on you. Because it will either destroy you or you will find joy. And if you find joy, you realize that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. And that once that perseverance has accomplished its work, it builds in us a joy that leads us to maturity and completion, to a satisfied life." 350 years before the Apostle James, there was a Greek prophet named Aristotle. And Aristotle said there are two forms of pleasure in the world that we live in. One of them is eudonia, which is the word from which we get hedonism. And that's sort of the pleasures of eating and drinking and procreating and sleeping and resting, the base pleasures. But then he said there is another kind of pleasure, and it's eudaimonia, and this is defined as a life well lived. And modern psychology backs this up. Modern psychology defines pleasure and happiness in two categories. There's a fundamental pleasure, which are the pleasures and the satisfactions that come from comfort, that come from eating and drinking and procreating and resting and enjoying ourselves. But there is a higher order of pleasure. And the higher order of pleasure is generosity and philanthropy, altruism, creating art, making a difference in the world. And almost every study of people who have been preoccupied with satisfying their fundamental pleasures, they have found themselves at the end of their lives less satisfied and find themselves feeling less significant because they preoccupied themselves with the fundamental pleasures rather than the higher order pleasures. Rather than with joy, they settled for happiness. In the Greek language, the word is kara. It's the word that appears here in Galatians chapter 5. It's the noun. It means joy. But the verb form is kairo. The word kairo means to rejoice. And it is used throughout the New Testament with an imperative tone or a determination that indicates it is a decision. When it is used to translate the Hebrew Bible, it appears 46 times in the book of Psalms. And it indicates an intentionality. I choose to rejoice. Psalm 118, verse 24. This is the day that the Lord has made. I will choose to rejoice and be glad in it. Even if the day is filled with things that don't make me happy. Even if the day is filled with danger and trouble and uncertainty, I choose joy. In fact, Paul makes a command of it in Philippians chapter 4, verse 4. He says, rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I command you, rejoice. Kaira. This is the nature of joy. It is the difference between joy and happiness. You see, it's theodicy. Theodicy is the theological argument for the goodness of God in the existence of evil. The difference between happiness and joy is that joy is a choice. And it is a choice to know that I am loved, and it is a choice to love. It is rooted in the idea that the fruit of the Spirit is love, and because I am loved by God, I rejoice. And as an expression of my love for God, I have joy. So that basically the difference between joy and happiness is joy is rooted in love, and joy is not circumstantial. Joy is not fragile. Happiness is conditional. Happiness is relative, but joy is a decision. That's why it's easy for me to say that my granddaughter, Frankie, she makes me happy, but she brings me joy. She gives me the chance to choose joy. I get pictures all the time, every day, from my daughter. And Diane and I look at each other, we're like, do you remember our kids when they were this age? And we don't. And I think it was because we were just too busy raising them. We were too busy fighting the fight of a parent. And now as a grandparent, we get to go, we're done now. Bye. We get all the good stuff. I think it also has to do with the fact that when our children were little, some of you may remember this, we had things called cameras, and the cameras had a thing called film in them. And the film, you had to take the picture, and then you had to finish the roll of film, and then you had to take that film, and you had to take it to someone who would develop the film. And then they would keep it for a few days, develop the film, and they would make little prints. And then you would have to go back and get the prints from the developer. And then once you got the prints from the developer, you could write a letter to your parents, and say, here's some pictures of your grandchildren. And a month after it happened, they got maybe 4 or 5 pictures. I get pictures every single day. In fact, I don't just get pictures because we walk around with phones with cameras in our pocket. I get videos like this one. adorable. But I don't know. I don't know what the world has for little Frankie. I don't know what will unfold over the course of her lifetime. And frankly, I have some grave concerns. The world that she is entering into. And I don't know if I'll be there to see it. I really don't. I mean, if she is like her mother and she waits till she's almost 40 to have a child, I will never see a great-grandchild. It's just not going to happen because I'm not going to live to 107. Who knows? I may not even see her graduate from college. I think we all understand the frailty of this life, and there's a possibility I may not see her graduate from high school. But on this day, I will choose joy. I will choose to celebrate. I will choose, because of God's love for me and my love for God, I will choose joy. She makes me happy, but she provokes me to joy. Do not settle for happiness. Go find joy.